All right.
Okay. So,
All right. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Very warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us this morning on the last day of Gobeshona to talk about what Sendai got to do with LLA. The LLA principles, as you might know, are the principles for locally led adaptation, and more than 70 organizations have signed on to these principles, which look at promoting and raising ambition on local adaptation in order to address the needs and the priorities of local communities who are most vulnerable to climate change. Many of us have also for many years been working on the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction, and we really came to this field. I know that Huairou Commission came to the field of climate change from the arena of disaster recovery and reconstruction, and then DRR, which is disaster risk reduction. And we were actively engaged in the local implementation of the Huairou Framework for Action, as well as are now very much engaged in the Sendai Framework, particularly looking at what it's going to take to accelerate the local implementation of the Sendai Framework. And to us, I think it's always seemed a bit of a problem or a gap, because in the climate arena, we don't hear people talking very much about the Sendai Framework. We know that this is the year that we start the midterm review of the Sendai Framework to take stock of how far countries and other stakeholders have come in advancing disaster risk reduction and building resilience. And Gobeshona is also a forum in which we want to examine our commitment to the locally led adaptation principles and look at how do we make ourselves accountable to our commitments, how do we hold others accountable, how do we assess where we are in terms of implementing these principles that we have committed to. And so let's our discussion today is really focused on highlighting that at the local community level, where and you'll be hearing from community leaders as well as someone who is a local official at the barangay level, it is more or less the same. What communities are doing to build resilience is the same, regardless of whether you see it through the lens of development, or you look at it through the lens of DRR, or you look at it through climate adaptation. Of course, all these things, there's much room for improvement, but even if they don't frame their work in terms of the different policy frameworks, we know that they're very much engaged in implementing these frameworks, including the SDGs. So the question then is, how can we benefit from having a more integrated perspective on community resilience, and what can institutions learn from what communities are doing and from this integrated holistic perspective, and how can we identify entry points and insights that will help us accelerate implementation of the Sendai Framework and the resilience of communities, particularly who are vulnerable, as well as accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement, while scaling up our ambition and addressing the priorities of the most vulnerable. So we have a terrific panel lined up here for you today. We have grassroots representatives from Africa and from Asia, and we also have someone who works with grassroots organizations, who's a part of Barangay Council, and then we have institutional experts who have spent a lot of time working on both DRR and now are also engaged in climate adaptation. We're very privileged to have with us Orghos Roy from the Asian Development Bank. He's the senior climate change specialist, and he's agreed to moderate this session for us. And Orghos, please feel free to share your own views while you're moderating. So I'll hand over to him, and he's going to take us through the next 45 minutes or so, where we're going to hear from the speakers. And I urge all of you to share your views and comments in the chat and any questions that you might have for the speakers, which we can then have the speakers respond to after they've spoken, right? All right, over to you, Orko.
Thank you so much,
Sorry.
Saranjana.
Maybe before that, we have to request Anvesha, my colleague, to take us through the Zoom protocols and some of the technologies related to the multi-language translation and interpretation that we have here. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Suranjana, and welcome everyone again to this session. Just to let you know, today's event is hosted by the Huairou Commission and the Slum Dwellers International. And we also want to thank ECAD for supporting us with the coordination and organizing this session, and also Gobeshona for giving us this space for the discussion. So before we move into the session, let me quickly walk you through some of the Zoom guidelines. Please note that the meeting is being recorded and we will make it available on our website at a later date. You can watch the recordings later. I request you to please close any non-essential applications on your device, such as Skype. And also please mute your microphone if you're not speaking. Since this is in a webinar format, you can make use of the chat box to introduce yourself, to write any comments or questions that you have throughout this discussion. And also, if you face any kind of technical issues, please notify. In the list, you can see Zoom Team D. You can write to them if you have any technical issues, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Please note that we also have interpretation available in 2 languages today, Bahasa and Tagalog, because we have speakers from Indonesia and also from the Philippines. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you can see a globe-like icon, and you can click on the languages. You can choose the language that you want to hear, and if you want to hear the original audio, you can hear it. Otherwise, you have to mute it. And I also request everyone to stay on the English channel, because that is where you will be able to hear everything in English. Thank you, everyone, and let's get started. Over to you, Orgo.
Thank you so much, Anisha, and good morning, everybody. Rather good afternoon from Manila. I'm very happy to moderate this session today. Thanks to Gobeshona for providing the platform for this discussion, and of course to our Commission and STI for organizing this discussion. I think from my perspective, this session is very important because of 2 reasons. So if we see the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a report focusing on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, there are 2 things which I noted. One is it clearly talks about how the largest gap in implementation of adaptation, risk reduction, and resilience measures exists in the low-income population. So obviously that means that we need to focus on that population group to minimize that gap. And secondly, the report is quite vocal in saying that integrated multi-sectoral adaptation risk reduction solutions, when they are implemented in close synergy also with addressing social inequality, those kind of solutions are much more effective and have much more longer term outcome. So I think it's very important to understand from the communities who are in many ways leading such integrated and multi-sectoral solutions at the local level, to hear from them and understand what is working, what are some of the barriers that they are facing, how they are interacting with their local stakeholders in the provincial government, national governments. At the same time, hear from policymakers and understand, so what is required to scale these initiatives in the context of accelerating in a Sendai implementation, as well as the local adaptation principles as introduced by Suranjana. So we are very happy that today's discussion, we have grassroots leaders as well as policymakers. So what I will do is we will start with one of the policymakers, then we'll go to grassroots leaders, hear from them and local barangay officials, and then again, go back to another policymaker and hear from his perspective. And lastly, I think from Asian Development Bank's perspective, I think this is important because we have recently launched a large-scale program looking at community resilience, and essentially to working with the governments and trying to understand how we can improve the enabling environment needed for more holistic actions to take place at the community level. So for me, it's very much a selfish motive to moderate this session and learn from it and see how we can inform ADB's work moving forward. So with that, I'm going to introduce the first speaker, who is Herjee Singh, the Senior Advisor of Climate Impacts at Climate Action Network International. Herjee, thank you so much for joining. I know you're on travel, so really appreciate your time. If we can directly dive into the discussion with you, and maybe start with one question that, considering your extensive experience of informing and influencing global policies, both on risk reduction as well as climate change adaptation, how do you think these two topics can be brought together in a manner that the implementation of these policies benefits the local people by providing the common policy architecture, directives, approaches, and resources? So really, how do we bring it together at the global level? Herjee, over to you, please.
Thank you, Agya. Sorry, I'm at a restaurant, so there'll be a bit of background noise. I hope you can hear me properly.
Yes, we can hear very clear. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to join you all, my old friends and some new faces. So starting, before I talk about how we can bring them together, I think we need to understand the challenge first. The reality is, some of us, so to give a bit more of my background, I am working in the climate space, but I come from humanitarian and disaster risk reduction community. And that's what made me realize that, unless we tackle climate change, we'll not be able to deal with the disaster. And somehow our efforts on the disaster risk reduction side or resilience building were not being sufficient because of the increasing risks that climate change was posing. And we all are aware 90% of disasters that we are facing are weather related. And on top of it, when you have slow onset events, this is something that the whole world is not prepared to deal with yet. So that's the context. And we also know when the adaptation concept was being developed, the adaptation, as a concept, if I can take the liberty of saying, has come more from the top, more from the environmental community. Whereas the grassroots experience has come from the humanitarian and disaster risk reduction community. Now, these experiences had to come together, and adaptation does bring a lot of scientific rigor that DRR community was kind of missing, because we were relying much more on our past experiences, on conventional risks, and we were doing things on ground and influencing policies. Whereas adaptation brings a new set of science as well as inputs and new disciplines coming together. And even now, when we look at where things are, I think the silos continue to remain largely where they were. Yes, conceptually, we do find many tools that have been developed on how to bring these concepts together, particularly at the conceptual level, I would say, but not at the grassroots level, because this session is talking about locally led adaptation. I still see that divide, not only at the practitioners level, but also at the policy level. Of course, Kamal is here, so he can talk much more from the policy perspective, and there are other colleagues from other countries. But what we see, even in countries like Bangladesh, where we have seen disaster management bodies and environmental communities coming together, yet we face those challenges where we don't see all the extreme weather events and slow onset events as part of the same spectrum, when we know a lot of experience can be exchanged between the two communities, and between the experiences of dealing with extreme weather events and slow onset disasters. But that challenge remains. So I think that's the first bit that we have to recognize. Now, how we can actually overcome that. Agya, you were talking about the IPCC Working Group 2 report. One very important thing that we need to understand, this report has analyzed 127 risks. And that, to me, is something that we need to be considering in our approaches as well, how we put risk at the center. And at the very local level, we should forget about which community we belong to. And this is where it can become a starting point for us to look at what kind of conventional risks communities face, what are the new risks that science tells us which we are currently facing, and in future that are going to be a lot more critical. For example, glacier melt, increasing pace of desertification, sea level rise, ocean acidification. You know, some of these risks that I'm talking about, which DRR community does not refer to very often. And only recently, in fact, speaking of India, I was reading the National Disaster Management Policy published in 2019. It does talk about sea level rise. So I think at the conceptual level, as I said earlier, it's beginning to come together. But if you go to the grassroots level, I don't think we are really looking at it. So I see putting risk at the center really can help in bringing bringing down those silos around adaptation and disasters reduction, or even the new challenge of loss and damage, where we will need to rehabilitate communities if sea level is going to swallow their homes and increase salinity in the farms to a level where farming is not possible anymore. How do we look at the entire spectrum, in kind of one screen, and not divide them into silos, and say, oh, this belongs to DRR and this belongs to adaptation. So, and this can only happen at the local level. And I'll say one more thing, Arya, before handing back to you. Another reason I find that challenge remains, or that silo remains from top to bottom, I think we are mixing practice and advocacy. At the international level, and because you talked about global perspective, we will continue to fight for adaptation as a separate stream and separate financing pot for the accounting purposes, because there is an obligation attached to climate finance. And even if we wish to integrate that, we talk about coherence, integration, mainstreaming, that all needs to happen at the local level. But at the international level, we have to count that money, because we are pushing developed countries to foot the bill of adaptation. But that does not mean that we have to continue talking the same lingo right at the local level. I think things should begin to kind of merge at the national level, where we will still see some kind of departmental thinking, which is required to drill down on number of issues. But as we move to subnational and local levels, it should completely dissolve. And that's where the bottom up planning, the local adaptation and resilience strategies are extremely important. Because when we talk about a human being and their lives, you can't break them into several disciplines. For them, it's one life, right? I'm facing a risk. The risk has increased, and I'm facing new risks. So if we have that as a starting point, then we all contribute to that planning process through science, through our previous DRR experience, through our humanitarian experience, which is going to be so valuable for planned relocation, which is going to be a real life situation. It already is, right? People are losing their homes and farms. So who has the experience? Humanitarian community has the experience. It has to scale that. It has to be scaled up. So yeah, sorry for taking a bit of time to respond to the question. I thought I'll just set the context.
No, thank you. That was incredibly useful, Herjee. Very, very appreciated. So I completely, take your message on the importance of looking at the entire spectrum of risk and essentially putting them in one basket, and then having that risk as a center point or starting point to take any decisions that a local community is taking, a local government is taking, or subnational government or national government. And also thanks for highlighting that even the silo exists. There are cases, as we talked about in India policy, where some progress are being seen, and hopefully we'll have more of it in the future. And on this distinction between practice and advocacy, which I found it very, very useful. I also think that advocacy, if that needs to maintain the silos for the rightful reason, then one should take advantage of that and try to then mobilize resources from two baskets instead of one, if that helps them to take the action on the ground, right? So thank you so much. Can I have one follow-up question to you? Just a very practical question. We have community leaders over here. So what tip do you have for a community leader when she or he is interacting with their national counterparts in country and making a case for bringing these topics together so that ultimately implementation at the ground level is responsive to collective local needs. So what would be your tip for them? Thank you.
I would say we need to be very real, very objective, and very pragmatic when we talk about community level engagement. You know, we all know that communities are the first responders to all these risks and challenges. They are the ones who have been dealing with it for generation, for hundreds of years, and they are experiencing those risks, firsthand. So they know how risks have increased. So their leadership in planning and implementation is paramount. There should not be any compromise on that count. However, we also need to recognize that there are, I'll refer back to those new risks and challenges and the new signs that has not been sufficiently transferred and disseminated at the local level, which means leaders and community practitioners do not have access to that science, and that gap has to be bridged. So on one hand, we need to recognize their role, and community leaders must tell policymakers and scientists that we need that information. That does not mean that their traditional knowledge is not going to be useful. It is going to be useful, but may not be as useful as it used to be, because when we talk about the new challenges of ocean acidification, right, we don't have a history of dealing with it. We talk about sea level rise at a scale, we don't have a history of dealing with it. But their rights, their informed choices are going to be extremely important when we develop these solutions. So I think community leaders should definitely say, allow us to lead, but at the same time, tell us science in a very, very simple manner so that it's accessible to us. And of course, they need more resources to deal with the challenge, because the way disasters are increasing, the current level of resources is not going to be sufficient. And I would say we should also invest in new knowledge systems. When we talk about early warning system, early warning we have seen only from disaster perspective, but now from the farming community, you need that information about weather every day in a very simple and accessible manner. So I think it's about looking at new science, but at the same time respecting traditional knowledge and respecting leadership of communities.
Thank you, Herjee. I'm sure a lot of grassroots leaders are here today, and they're hearing that the fact of talking about their leadership role in planning and implementation is something the national governments need to recognize it. At the same time, recognize they need support for scientific information, for new knowledge and resources that will enable them to deliver those planning and implementation duties on the grounds. So thanks a lot, Herjee. That's been very, very useful. Maybe I thought it's a good time now, before we start hearing from grassroots leaders, to move to Suranjana once. And Suranjana, you talked in the initial introductory discussion about this two, the Sendai Framework and its priorities, and the local adaptation and its principles. Do you just want to give a little bit of explanation on how they converge or they don't converge?
So I prepared this one slide or which people can think of it as a work in progress, in which I was trying to link what communities are doing. If you look at that slide, you can see the kinds of things that communities are doing at the center, how they're linked to the priorities for action in the Sendai Framework, where you can see that understanding risk is about risk mapping and analysis using community data to identify the most vulnerable households. And the LLA principles have the first principle is about having a robust understanding of risk. The second priority in Sendai focuses on risk governance. And similarly, you can see that the LLA principles talk about devolved decision-making, looking at structural inequalities, flexible programming, and iterative learning, and transparency and accountability, as well as collaboration. There, if you look at what communities are trying to do, it's all around influencing public decision-making processes, partnering with government and other stakeholders, and monitoring government programs, demanding greater accountability. So again, it's very much aligned. The third one around the Sendai priority speaks about investing in DRR. Here again, we know that communities are looking at all kinds of resources to invest in DRR. You have their own resources. You have a lot of savings and credit groups which are putting in their own savings. You have community funds which have been developed both by the Slum Dwellers International and Huairou Commission, where communities are engaged in designing how the fund is used. And we're looking at that as a central principle, that communities playing more of a role in designing and looking at how funds can be better aligned, how the funding mechanism can be better aligned and more responsive to what communities need done. And here the LLA principles are talking about patient, predictable funding for the local level and investing in local capacities to leave behind institutional legacies. And the last one, actually, I haven't exactly figured out how we have to, which of the LLA principle speaks to it, but we know that with emergency preparedness and recovery, again, there's a lot of work being done on the ground by communities to prepare contingency plans, coordinate with government institutions as well as NGOs, and basically play a more active role in shaping both the emergency response process, but also the recovery and reconstruction after disasters, to make sure that the longer term development processes and recovery and reconstruction are actually building back better institutions that are more, and as both from a structural and non-structural point of view, are more responsive to the needs of local communities. So this is just a sort of a work in progress that we're still thinking through, and I'm not sure we're fully on the right track with everything, but just to give people an idea that we're focused on community initiatives and community resilience, but we can see that there's a lot of alignment between the locally led adaptation principles and the local implementation of the Sendai Framework. Thanks, Orko.
Thanks, Suranjan. I think there's a great framework as a starting point for our discussion. And I can already see various things that Herjee talked earlier, which can be easily mapped in this framework and in the central column where to show where communities are taking leadership, but also where communities need additional support from the higher levels of government. So let's keep this framework in mind, and we can revisit again at the end of the session. I'll move to our next speaker, which is Violet, she would say. Violet is the founder and director of the Shibuya Community Health Worker from Kenya, and she's also the chair of Huairou Commission's Governing Council. Thank you, Violet, for joining us from Kenya. We really appreciate it. Really want to hear from you about some of your experiences in looking at concrete solutions on reducing vulnerability and disaster risk and adaptation, and some of your lessons on how or what kind of support you guys have been able to mobilize from your higher levels of government in Kenya. So over to you, Violet, please.
Yes, my good morning. I hope I cannot go with that because I know we are in different zones. So my name is Violet. As you said, I'm the founder of Shibuya Community Health Workers, which is based in the western region of Kenya. Shibuya Community Health Workers began as an organization that was working on health activities in the community from the time of HIV/AIDS. So food security and nutrition are at the center of our work. And as an organization that works in rural community, we do not do food supply. We actually use our own farm to be able to grow food that will be sufficient for families, but also a nutritious food that can be able to keep families healthy. So in 2008, we experienced a very big change where most of the land had been degraded because of flooding that was happening every time, which actually caused soil erosion. In our community, the lands are slopey, most of the lands are slopey, so a lot of soil was washed away. This actually contributed to many households not having food. There was totally insufficient food at household level, particularly those that are led with the women, because as rural women, We do agriculture to enhance food security, but also it's our livelihood. So that also compromised the livelihood of most of the families. So in a mapping report that we conducted in 2010, that was led by grassroots women with resources from Huairou Commission through CEDA funded project, we were able to identify that land degradation was the most disaster that we were experiencing, and soil fertility had really been compromised. The soil, we could not produce food from the soil that we had. So we came up with an action plan with the agricultural office during our feedback meeting of the mapping report, where we selected 50 farmers to be like the demonstration farmers that would start a process of soil management and rehabilitation. The grassroots women, we were able to actually consolidate all our plans together. And I just want to tell you, it wasn't so easy because the agricultural department believes more in chemical fertilizer. So they would say increase fertilizer, do top tracing, and many things that are related to the Western way of farming. And for us as grassroots women, that was not sustainable because the fertilizer is not pocket friendly to us. We also shy off from using chemical fertilizer because, as you heard from me, most of the families that we were dealing with were affected with HIV/AIDS. They are living on ARVs. So consumption of a lot of fertilizer was actually a worry for us. And in many families, we were also dealing with orphans and vulnerable children, food security, which we could not continue to use fertilizer. It was a big worry on their health status. So as grassroots women, we sat with the agricultural office and really had to convince them on the kind of agricultural practices that we wanted to do. Most of these that we learned from our grandmothers and others that we had learned through peer learning from Huairou Commission. So under soil management and rehabilitation, we identified practices like composting, making farmyard manure, mulching, practices like doing terraces, crop slope barriers, vegetation that would actually stop water from growing where we have slopes. And this actually worked very well. To be able to convince the community to make these practices get more expanded and learning, we conducted field days with agricultural department, where farmers would come to these homes at the ward level and learn from the grassroots women what they were doing. And this expanded. In 3 years, we were actually able to move from acreage of 45 to 250 acreage that the grassroots women had improved, which actually was a very big plus for us. In 2014, we became the champions of soil rehabilitation and management, and GIZ, through a fund called COPA, identified Shibuya as one of the experts, and they funded us on organizing our activities around soil rehabilitation, including expansion. What I want to say that it was a little bit of a challenge because most of these partners do not fund organizing. For us, we like organizing like these field days. We also want grassroots women to meet with government and do feedback meetings, but for them, they fund more on practice, direct practice, the number of acreage you are improving, maybe a little bit of money with the linkage with agricultural extension, where you go direct to the farm. But for us, we showed them how much we invest in planning as grassroots communities. And for some time, I want to say that we are celebrating because now the partners that fund our soil protection activities are funding peer learning and exchanges, are funding field days, and they actually know that our power in organizing the community is actually very important. We are actually also demonstrated how we are able to mobilize resources, how we work very successfully with the local authority. Now, because of this, we have been among the organizations from the only organization in rural community that worked on soil rehabilitation and management policy that is now underway in the national government that is going to be our soil rehabilitation policy for Kenya. We have put a lot of input on what does it mean to do soil rehabilitation in relation to things like land, accessibility to land that were not coming up because they are usually treated separately, and also looking at how to use this to promote the SDGs, like for hunger and poverty. I want to say that we have really expanded the practices from 29 wards. Now we are in 22 wards in 3 counties in Kenya, which this is a very big plus. We also had a peer, through Huairou Commission, peer learning between Kenya and India, Africa and India, where all the African groups that work with the Huairou Commission and India came to our community. And for us, that is the real partnership and how we want to actually ensure that some of these practices can go beyond one region, beyond one country, to other communities also. Shibuye has a slot right now on the fund that is being funded by World Bank in our county, which is called Climate Smart, and we are on the steering committee because of this. So just in a summary, I actually want to say that it is very important for us to recognize the contribution of grassroots women. They are realistic, they're actually based on the real experiences, and investing in these practices, investing in partnership, and more so in organizing, so that when we are sharing resources, we don't actually make grassroots women have restricted funding and sit with the community. Recognizing grassroots women data collection is also important than just going one way of research, because also our mapping was able to surface all these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Violet, for sharing your excellent experience. I clearly see what you talked about and what Herjee was saying earlier. I mean, the very fact that you have connected the work on food security and agriculture with health, which is your starting point in many ways. I think that's very, very critical, because Herjee did talk about looking at the entire spectrum of risks, and risks are not just always natural hazard related, but other kind of risks are also there that communities are facing day in and out. So that, for me, that's a great learning. And secondly, the idea that how you guys demonstrated to national government that you guys have the capacity, you work as an able partner of local authorities, and you're also able to share and bring international practices through the peer-to-peer learning that Huairou Commission facilitated. And for me, the key learning over here is for decision makers who are deciding on allocation of resources, that when we are talking about risk reduction and adaptation resources at the local level, it's just not the resources for the actual practice or actual technique, but it's also resources to be for the approach, or in this case, organizing communities, which takes a long time and years, and building their capacity and the trust with the local governments. So that process-oriented approach is very, very critical, if not more. And we need to have sufficient resources allocated in a manner that can be flexibly used. And I think that's also one of the principles of local adaptation. So thank you so much, Violet, once again. We'll get back to you in the open panels at the end of the session. I'll move to our next speaker, who is Ibu Muriani from Yakum Emergency Unit in Indonesia. Thank you, Ibu, for joining us. We really want to hear from you about your experience of working at the local level, also working in terms of your local governments, and how your work is trying to leverage or influence what local government in Indonesia is doing through the Village Development Fund and other processes. So over to you, Ibu. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih. Perkenalkanlah, saya Muriani, Ketua Kelompok Wantrabat Wanita Terampil dan Hebat Pedak Baru Yogyakarta, Indonesia. Saya tinggal di bantaran Sungai Gajah Wong yang rentan terhadap ancaman banjir. Apabila musim penghujan tiba, apabila terjadi banjir, kami dan masyarakat mengungsi ke daerah yang lebih tinggi karena wilayah kami masuk ke dalam dataran yang rendah. Hal tersebut mempengaruhi aktivitas kami sehari-hari. Pekerjaan kami menjadi terganggu dan pemasukan berkurang. Selain merugikan secara ekonomi, secara kesehatan, mental, dan fisik juga terganggu karena lingkungan yang kotor dan tidak sehat. Banjir juga merusak harta benda dan perabotan mereka, dan kadang anaknya hingga bolos sekolah. Dengan menggunakan pemetaan risiko, kami menginisiasi untuk membuat jalur evakuasi yang paling mudah dan aman dilewati masyarakat, termasuk kelompok rentan dan titik kumpul untuk menyelamatkan diri. Kami juga membunyikan kentongan terbuat dari kayu bambu apabila debit air sudah mulai meninggi. Beberapa tahun lalu, kami sering mengalami banjir. Kemudian di kelompok perempuan kami mulai mengatur arisan di tanggul. Karena keterbatasan dana untuk membangun tanggul permanen, kami memulainya dengan tanggul sederhana. Setiap anggota wajib mengumpulkan 1 karung pasir setiap bulan dan menggunakannya sebagai penahan atau tanggul di sepanjang bantaran sungai. Untuk mengurangi dampak bencana, kami berupaya menyiapkan lumbung pangan, mengelola kebun sayur dan kolam ikan, serta pertanian lainnya. Masalah kebersihan dan kesehatan menjadi perhatian utama. Itulah mengapa kami mendirikan bank sampah yang dapat membantu kami mengelola sampah. Selain lingkungan yang bersih, ini juga merupakan alternatif pemasukan. Kami belajar bahwa informasi yang akurat mengenai potensi banjir bisa didapatkan dari masyarakat yang tinggal di sekitar Sungai Gajah Wong. Selain tergabung dalam tim siaga bencana, kami juga berjaring dengan kelompok komunitas sungai Gajah Wong atau Forsidas, Forum Komunikasi Daerah Aliran Sungai Gajah Wong, untuk membangun ketangguhan masyarakat serta mitigasi bencana. Dalam forum ini ada banyak kegiatan, misalnya pelatihan dan giat bersama. Dengan adanya kelompok perempuan, kami bekerja bersama masyarakat dan pemerintah setempat untuk memberikan bantuan secara tunai kepada masyarakat yang terdampak banjir. Kami juga menggalang dana secara lokal sebagai dana siaga untuk meningkatkan sumber daya dan memperkuat kesiapan kami. Ini adalah upaya dari, oleh, dan untuk kami. Maka kerjasama dengan pemerintah setempat dengan masyarakat sangat penting sehingga semua masyarakat dapat terinformasi tentang potensi bencana dan aksi apa saja yang bisa dilakukan dan melibatkan partisipasi serta kontribusi dari berbagai elemen masyarakat termasuk kelompok rentan. Dengan pemetaan risiko, kelompok perempuan bisa menyuarakan perspektifnya dan terlibat aktif dalam raising awareness dan membangun kesiapsiagaan baik di keluarga maupun di komunitas. Meski jejaring dengan pemerintah kadang sulit dilakukan, tapi membina kerjasama dengan aktor lain, misalnya universitas, forum sungai, dan lainnya, sebagaimana juga bermanfaat untuk memperluas pembelajaran dan praktik baik. Jadi advokasi ke pemerintah juga bisa semakin kuat karena dilakukan secara bersama-sama.
Thank you so much, Ibu. That was very, very useful. And specifically, again, I do see some common threads with what Violet discussed earlier in the context of your solutions being in the context of food security again. Also, the importance you highlighted about partnering with local governments and local authorities. And looking at also issues of risk beyond the hazards in the larger environmental space. You did mention something which I think was critical, that risk mapping, is not just a technical exercise, but very much when local women are involved in the risk mapping processes, it allows them to better understand risk and accordingly then negotiate decisions around risk reduction with local authorities. And I think that itself deepens the democratic process itself in the local area. So I think the risk mapping as a tool is very, very powerful when done correctly to really help shift the power balance eventually between government and local communities. So thank you so much, Ibu, for sharing your experience. We will move to our third panelist now. We are very happy to have with us Mr. Frederick, or Fed, better known as Fred Marcelo, who is the Barangay Council from Bagong Silangan in Quezon City in Metro Manila. Fed, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, you work very closely with the community groups in Philippines. I'll be keen to hear from you. What are some of the challenges you face, or maybe solutions you have found to convince your higher level of authorities in the Philippines to take up and scale up local level interventions that grassroots communities are implementing on the ground? So how do you convince your your bosses up to take this forward? Sorry.
He's on mute. Fed, you're on mute, I think, and we can't see you.
Hello, sorry, Saranjana. I'm so sorry because my internet connection is a bit problematic.
Okay, if you
thank
feel
you.
it's bad, you can turn off your video if your internet is weak. But
okay. Can you hear me, Saranjana?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Our investment is focused primarily on good governance, and that is why people are empowered, and they were able to participate in our spaces like the Barangay Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council. So they were able to, I believe in my I have there my presentation. I have sent it to you. You can see there that there is a risk mapping. Prior to being elected as a government official, I have learned in Dampa and with the help of Huairou as well, that risk mapping is not just a tool, but it is also a strategy in addressing the lapse in disaster preparedness. So we have to be prepared. As you can see there in our map, that is the map of Barangay Bagong Silangan, and that was taken after the Typhoon Ketsana. So as you can see, almost 40% of our land area, if there is a worst case scenario like Typhoon Ulysses, which happened in 2020, what do you call this? You can see the red areas there. Those are the areas affected if it's a worst case scenario. And going back to the question of Arga, how are we able to convince our higher government officials like Mayor Joy Belmonte of Quezon City? We were able to demonstrate with the help of women leaders that we organized. I believe organizing is also a very important strategy. So if women are organized, they were all capacitated. They can articulate what they need, especially in a disaster risk reduction. As you can see in that photo, those are the scenarios in 2020. So while we are fighting for COVID-19, as you can see, we're also fighting for the disasters caused by climate change. As you can see, the floods are actually near the second floor of the house of the residential area in our community. So again, focusing on community organizing and us in the local government side, we have to implement, or we have to demonstrate the good governance, the aspect of good governance, which is on the basis of implementing participation, making spaces available to civil society organization or community-based organization, and also transparency. In our committee, in my committee in disaster risk reduction, we open the spaces for them wherein they can share to us what are the things that they are needed. So as you can see, these life vests, or the life vests that we purchased, those are from the plans of the community. And this is what happened during, on that slide, those are what had happened during after Typhoon Ulysses. Their farms were affected. And with the help of our city officials, we were able to encourage them to support our local, our grassroots leaders, especially they're all women, most of them are women. So to invest in their capacity development, and at the same time to invest in the urban gardening project or urban farming project of Mayor Joy Belmonte. And as you can see, these actually, can you show the next slide? Sorry. Okay. That those are the risk mapping activities that we are doing. These are actually very recent. Actually, we're doing that every year because as you can because the profile of Barangay Bagong Silangan in our community, it's very large. The population is dense. So every year we have to make a profiling on how many are PWDs, how many are pregnant women. So they can so these women leaders are actually aware of the situation, and they're informed on where the evacuation areas and what are they going to do in the evacuation site. So basically, we delegate the task to them, and by doing so, not just delegating it, but also empowering them in understanding this. I also said this a while ago, and I also heard it earlier from Saranjana, that there is an accountability. So participation, transparency, and accountability. So in accountability, in Filipino, it's pananagutan. So we open those spaces, and we allow ourselves to be monitored by these community-based organization. And in that photo, as you can see, women are the ones leading in the rebuilding of their communities after the aftermath of Ulysses, and they know what to do. As you can see, they're the ones lifting the debris and other fallen trees in the area to rehabilitate their community and to rebuild their farm. And going back to the transparency aspect and accountability, we are inviting them into our spaces. As what I have said earlier, we are allowing them to be monitored, to monitor our programs, and also they can suggest what other programs that are relevant to their communities. Because Bagong Silangan is very big, as you can see in the profile earlier. Our community has 39,000 families, or basically we're handling about 156,000 population in estimate. So this one project of our barangay and community have been supported by the local government, Mayor Joy Belmonte, and then eventually it was being picked up by the national government agency, particularly the Department of Agrarian Reform in NCR, and also the Department of Agriculture. And here, grassroots women are the ones we're being trained to what do you call this, to diversify the crops, especially they can plant disaster or drought resilient crops like kamote and other plants that they can plant during summer or drought, or if we're experiencing drought. And then also because we're experiencing flooding also, there are also flood resilient plants like corn being planted in that area, so that even if they're affected, they can easily get back better or get back into their normal situation after the disaster. Because after Ulysses in 2020, last year in 2021, we're also affected by habagat or monsoon rains. So those are basically flooding every year is being prepared in our barangay, not just for flooding but also for fire, because our community, because of lack of urban planning in the previous administrations, we're also prone to fire, and also we're also prone to earthquake because we're living in the West Valley Fault. There in that picture, you can see the plants or the vegetables being planted in our area. So, okay, these are the challenges or the recommendations that we, based on our experience, I consulted our grassroots women leader in the community. So they said that there should be an easy access to risk financing, assistance in cooperative development, training on alternative crop production and utilization of fertilizer, and deepening understanding on the climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So sorry for that. Okay.
Thank you so much, Fred. That was incredibly useful. And again, once again, highlighting some very, very key important insights. I mean, you talked about, from a risk perspective that Herjee started, you brought in the discussion about the current pandemic, of course, but also issues around fire and earthquake, which most communities are facing in the Philippines. I think you had a very powerful message where you talked about how local governments can create an inclusive space for women and give them certain authority to help in local government's work, in this case, monitor progress of implementation of programs. But that shouldn't be just as a delegation of work, but actually it's an empowerment, because you are including local communities in informing and influencing local government's decisions. That was very, very strong. And of course, the importance of organization or organized communities, once again, you highlighted. I also wonder, I did hear in all the three case studies a very important link from point of view from food security, agriculture, livelihoods. So I think that's also a common thing which I'm seeing in most of the cases over here. So with that, let me pass on to our final speaker, Kamal Kishore. We're very happy to have you, Kamal, who is a member secretary of the National Disaster Management Authority of India. And Kamal has a huge experience in both disaster reduction and climate change adaptation at various levels, including at the global level. So Kamal, a couple of questions for you. Maybe if we start with the first one. Just hearing the three case studies, where of course we saw in each cases the local communities have been partnering with local authorities, whether it's the agricultural extension officers or the Met office or the DRR office or the health department. So that is very, very important. So, and if you go back what Herjee was saying about looking at a risk all in a comprehensive manner, all kind of risks together. So how do you think at the local level this convergence should happen to ensure that local government is in a better position to provide, to be more responsive to local needs of the local communities? How do we make the convergence happen at the local level, essentially? Over to you, Kamal.
Thanks, Argyo. I think it's a difficult challenge how different types of support from the state, from the instruments of the state through different programs and projects converge at the community level. And I think there are three things that I would say. The first thing is that the kind of investment we've made in national and subnational institutions, the same kind of investment needs to happen at the local level institution as well. Our local governments are closer to reality, but they are under-resourced, both in terms of capacities as well as funding. So I think, how do we have planning capacity, coordination capacity, conceptualizing capacity, implementation capacity at the level of the government? The second thing is that the feedback loop from the ground to up really needs to be much stronger than it is right now in most countries. And it is a very challenging thing to accomplish, because especially when you are dealing with manifestations of extreme risk, there is expectation from the government to be decisive, creating a that you're decisive versus, having a more adaptive approach are somewhat there is a tension between the two, at least in terms of public perception. And I don't know how that can really be resolved. So I think that is really, I almost would like to say that we need to create some sort of a social demand for adaptive governance. When governments change their decisions or modify their decisions, there should be greater appreciation for that. That should be seen not as a reflection of not knowing their mind, but it should be seen as a reflection of responding to feedback from the ground. So that is the second point. My third point is that while we talk a lot about how things converge at a particular community or a particular geographical unit at the local level, we perhaps do not talk enough about how these things connect horizontally. So, we talk about leadership of communities, leadership of community groups, women. All of that is extremely important. But who plays the coordination role between one community and the other? You know, in the current risk scenario globally, everybody lives downstream. So what's happening in one community or the actions taken in one community or not taken in one community will have implications for the others. So even the sort of legislative instruments that we have, they talk about levels. You know, they talk about national, subnational, local levels, but they do not talk about how these things cohere horizontally. I think that is a challenge we need to address. And this challenge came particularly alive in the context of the pandemic. So, you know, if there is one state which is, you know, a state or one local government which is enforcing certain kind of, you know, non-pharmacological interventions, and the adjoining one is not doing that, then the effect of one gets sort of nullified. So who plays that coordination role? You know, we must realize that despite all the best knowledge at the community level, lived experience at the community level, in certain respects, there will always be some blind spots at that level. And there has to be a mechanism to sort of overcome that. And I think there should be, that's where we need to exercise our imagination. So these are my three big things. You know, one is we really need to have a greater investment in local governments in terms of capacities. The second thing is that a feedback loop, social demand for adaptive governance, and finally, you know, some mechanism for horizontal coordination between communities.
Thank you so much, Kamal, for sharing your insights on these three very, very important points. And I completely agree. And I think it's, you talked about the last one, horizontal coordination. I think that's also becoming very, very critical because this whole risk issue is also so systemic in nature, right? So it's not just about the blind spot, but also potentially the trade-offs, because sometimes you gain from something from the measures you undertake. Recognizing the others might suffer, but that doesn't, because it's your interest to ensure your you know, your livelihoods or assets are protected. So I think this becomes very complicated, and you're absolutely right on who really coordinates to ensure that cohesion at the horizontal level is critical. So with that, let me open it up now for discussion. I know a lot of questions were there, but colleagues, please feel free to come in and you know, even you know, speak your question, put in a camera. I know Sheila was there in the session. Sheila, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Do you want to just share some of your reflection of what you heard from the other panelists, which might just go ahead.
This has been a very exciting session, and I think your ability to bring out the issues that are important for all of us working on the ground also shows how familiar we have become to these sensitized issues. So let me I've made some notes, and I'd like to hear what community groups say, and I'll start with Kamal Kishore's interventions. This issue of how to kickstart coordination, how to bring communities and local authorities together is something that all of us face all the time. And all our experience, I mean, all the things that the earlier speakers from local experience said show that a crisis produces opportunities to collaborate, to coordinate, to communicate in ways that you never thought was possible. The challenge is, how do you institutionalize that? And I think that that has become a starting point for many groups. And I think those of us in social movements have to now take advantage of those things to systematize the local relationships and work with local authorities to bring other state, subnational and national groups, coordinating groups into that process. That's very empowering if and when that happens. And the experiences we have seen in the Philippines, both in the last Gobeshona, we talked about Quezon City's mayor's program with both Huairou Commission and our STI affiliates on the challenges of food security and the amount of space that was available to have community kitchen gardens. So I'm just saying that that there's a way by which we have to communicate these possibilities that are to do with engagement. Something which Violet said is something that made me realize that, you know, in many ways, when communities express challenges, you know, they are like the canary in the mines. You know, it's an early warning system of something that is systemically not happening. So Huairou Commission's work on home care, which Violet's group started, and the increasing recognition of the non-monetization of that and the impact that has on systems related to disasters and care and other things, comes much later. And another interesting example that somebody else said about IPCC is that all of us have been talking about displacement due to bad land laws, displacement due to large mitigation projects, displacement related to sea level rise and other things. Till this IPCC report, displacement was not seen as a very important issue to be addressed in all aspects, not only of climate change, but also of development. And for all of us who are working on the ground, this has become a very, very important issue that has very little governance and financial and organizational investments, both at local and global levels. They are again treated as another disaster, evictions, or displacement. So I feel we need to bring that into our discussions. And the other thing which Herjee said about science, I think that grassroots groups require to make demands on scientists to produce not only scientific knowledge that underpins the choices that we have to make, but also in producing solutions that are in the public domain for all of us to appropriate. Because in other discussions in the Gobeshona and other group meetings and everything, we realized that a lot of research has been financed in the private domain and is patented and not available in the public domain for communities and people. So how do we balance this? Because we can't wish away the privatization of research, but are we going to wait for another 10, 15 years to look at the kind of balance that we require for publicly accessible solutions that are affordable for the expanding number of really poor and vulnerable communities worldwide? Because we are not linking the larger impoverishment that's going on globally and the expansion of vulnerable groups and their lack of access to solutions. And social movements can't keep managing that by and of themselves. So somewhere in this conversation in which we've had this opportunity to bring global institutions with local realities, we have to factor these kinds of things inside and look at what we can do. And finally, the proposition I make here is that in yesterday's conversation, which again was hosted by STI and the Huairou Commission, there was a very clear distinction. I think Celine is here and she made that, between survival strategies and resilience strategies. poor people's ability to survive is often celebrated and then ignored. But the production of resilient solutions that improve people's quality of life, that reduce mobility, that reduce risks, that hold institutional, local, and global arrangements to be accountable for their loss. So whether you put it in these different silos of loss and damage and resilience and adaptation and mitigation, ultimately, they all, like you started off saying, they all coalesce in human beings who are vulnerable. And so how in our language, in our strategies, in our discussion, we become more comfortable in breaching these silos. I want to feel comfortable talking about large mitigation projects and what they're doing to poor communities. I want to be able to talk about the challenges of plastic and what they are doing to ocean life, to poor people's life, to our food chains. So we are finding that everything is like a khichdi, it's like a mixture when it comes to poor people. And we need the intellectual stamina to do all that. So I'm really excited at this conversation. And I think that both Huairou Commission and STI need to maintain these amazing linkages that we have with people in different levels of governance and intellectual thought and networks to keep creating these linkages to be more robust. And by bringing community leaders into these global conversations, both Huairou Commission and we know that it changes the manner in which global organizations talk about local vulnerability. When there is a representative in the room that you can look into the face of and say, yes, we recognize your presence and we hold the things that are important for you as part of our agenda. Otherwise, it gets forgotten in these larger macro discussions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sheila. It was very, very useful. Any other comments, suggestions, or any specific comments to the panelists or any observations? Please feel free to comment. It's supposed to be a discussion. So
I have my hand up. Can I come in?
yes, please, Celine, go ahead.
Yes, I'm Celine D'Cruz. I'm presently a visiting researcher with ICHAD, but I'm also a founder member of Slum Dwellers International and Spark in India. So my comment is more to the instigation from Herjee Singh, which was for me very, very insightful because, so much gets lost in words and translation. And you're looking at DRR from the local perspective and looking at adaptation coming from the climate valas from the top and how you bring these two worlds together. As a practitioner, when I hear these conversations, I'm all the time trying to translate this to community leaders, mostly women, and how does one talk about all of this to them, right? And from my own experience of working with many communities in the Philippines and in other places, what you see is communities find it very easy when you break this whole learning into like compartments, because learning happens on the ground very differently from all the conversations we have. So they really like it when you say, these are the strategies before a crisis, these are the strategies during the crisis, and these are the strategies post-crisis. And that's how you simplify all these complicated conversations. And I'm wondering whether it's possible for this community to bring that element of science along with this practice of looking at, can we create tools within these three categories that makes it easier for local actors and communities to institutionalize what they're already doing. So Philippines communities, and we call, for example, earthquake communities, from a phase of going through, hell of dealing from one typhoon to the other. Now they brought land on the mountaintop. So when they know there's a sign saying that there is some typhoon, they have a second house on the mountain and they continue to do their income generation down in the valley when the flood stops. The whole crisis was staying in a transit camp in a municipal school, which traumatized the young girls because they were exposed and feeling very vulnerable in that context. And each and every day when the school started, they had to leave the school And at the end of the day, they had to go into the school. So this is no fun for any family when you've lost your land, you're dying to go back to your land, and then you're in a transit accommodation that makes you very insecure. So Harjit Singh, going back to you, yeah, I think, can we like break this into learning material and break this into, look at local practices and put these into these categories of before, during, and after a crisis? How do communities deal with it? Because then you get the short-term, medium-term, and long-term perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Celine. I know Harjit had to leave because he was in travel, but Kamal, do you want to come in and do you want to respond to anything on what kind of tools can be provided at the local level to overcome these?
I think what my first reaction to the provision of tools which are developed elsewhere and then applied to the local level is a little bit of skepticism. I can tell you that my organization, National Disaster Management Authority, produces a whole lot of material for local level use, to be translated in the local languages and used, etc. But then I'm never sure how effective it really is and how much of it is really a supply-driven thing. My own first inclination is always to use what is happening at the community level, the risk language being used there, the cultural context, the cultural resources at the local level, and build from there. Now, there are some aspects where I think some external, I don't want to call it intervention, but support. There is this great model in Karnataka, for example, which is a very high density of weather stations across the state. Karnataka's and the impact of having that kind of support at the community level, so that that support fosters a better and a little more scientific understanding of what's happening at the local level. So I think there is a place for that, but my own inclination would be to use the cultural context, the lived experience as a starting point for developing these materials that Celine was talking about, rather than have this massive central government or state government led program, which will always be limited by design in terms of its imagination.
Thank you so much, Kamal. Any other participant would like to come in? The question is,
I can say.
Yes, Ranjana, go ahead, please.
So firstly, I think this has been a super interesting discussion that's touching on a lot of things, including this issue of tools and learning. Sorry, excuse me. And how, what kind of tools are helpful, where they should come from, how do you develop the right ones? But I do acknowledge the need. I agree very much with what Kamal is saying around local tools and so on, but there's a huge need for us to understand, not just communities, even those of us who are sort of intermediaries, to understand much more about how to link climate science to our work, how, to understand climate science more, and then to find ways to translate that into what does it mean in terms of impact, and how should it inform actions that are being taken at the local level. And even, I think, starting the conversation with climate scientists is a huge challenge that we see. And I think the other piece I want to comment on is this idea of survival and what Sheila said on how things that don't work are also sort of early warning systems for how a system will ultimately respond in a crisis. And of course, we saw that in the COVID crisis, but also then we need to look at what communities are doing locally in terms of caregiving, and caregiving in a broader sense, not just caregiving around health issues at the community level. But if you looked at the COVID crisis, there was caregiving that was more women getting organized to work at a community level with local governments to provide information, to access health services, to support people to go to get tested, to get treated. And the work, again, that people are doing on food security and in emergencies and beyond emergencies is often also around filling a gap that occurs in crisis between the time that humanitarian responses or social protection responses from the government kick in. So in that sense, it's a very, very important function. And if one were to institutionalize those things and see them as part of a larger sort of a systemic response where some part has to be taken on by local communities because of their proximity to the crisis and the people who need assistance, then there's another level at which humanitarian agencies and governments come in with their support. Then it creates a larger sort of a systemic response strategy, which, even though some aspects may be considered survival or coping, are actually being sort of integrated to create a larger strategy that supports and prepares people for what to do in a crisis. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Suranjana. Any other questions, suggestions? We're running out of time. Okay, I don't see any hands raised. If I missed somebody, please feel free to come in. Okay, if not, I will not say I'm trying to summarize, because I think that's impossible to do, but I'll just share a few thoughts which I found it very useful. First of all, I think we heard from communities as well as policymakers, 3 broad strategies that work to ensure locally led actions on whether you call it DRR, adaptation, resilience, doesn't matter, can be potentially recognized and scaled up. One is a strategy that allows organization of communities or organizing communities to happen. That itself is an important strategy. Secondly, risk mapping is an important strategy, provided risk mapping is able to bring in the scientific knowledge, which we heard a lot, that's important, and the cultural and local issues that Kamal highlighted together, and provides a space for the local communities and women to lead the risk mapping exercise and use it as a tool to negotiate their needs with the local authorities, and in the process, and deepen democratic processes essentially. And the third strategy for me was how local governments can create space to formally recognize local community groups and give them certain tasks, which not only helps local governments reduce their own burden, but also eventually empowers the local communities. And this also, as Suranjana talked about, such tasks could help filling the in-between gap when a formal response happens in a post-crisis situation. So I think these 3 strategies of organizing communities, risk mapping, and creating space is very important. We also heard about 3 key actions to improve the enabling environment or governance, let's say. The importance of strengthening enabling partnerships between local communities and local governments and local stakeholders is a key thing to improve governance. We heard from Kamal about the importance of strengthening the feedback loop of the lessons or the experiences of the communities feeding back into higher levels of policy making, which allows the policy making to be more adaptive. And I think that's very, very important in the context of where risk is changing so fast and will be evolving continuously. And the third action around governance is on the issue of, again, Kamal highlighted about the issue of institutionalizing horizontal coordination and have some kind of institutional mechanism to do that. The third bunch of things what I heard is around investment ideas. And over here again, if I just have to forcibly talk about three ideas, is one is importance of investing in processes and not just investing in the technical solution or the actual activity on the ground, which is of course important, but investing in processes becomes very, very important. Second is the importance of investing not only in communities, but investing in the local governments itself, because at the end of the day, that's where resources should lie, so that local communities can get support from them. And the third important point is investing in solutions which are perhaps more, has a multiple benefits, let's put it like that, because all the examples talked about solutions on food security, which has impacts on health. We talked about solutions around, so I think this multiple solutions around multiple benefits is important at a local level, because we just don't have the time or the resources to deal with solutions one by one for every single problem. So for me, these three, let's say, basket of interventions, one around strategies, focusing on organizing, risk mapping, and creating space. 3 actions for governance, looking at partnerships, feedback loop, and institutionalization of horizontal coordination. And 3 types of investment ideas around investing in local governments, investing in processes, and investing in solutions that provide multiple benefits beyond just purely risk reduction or adaptation. So that was something that I took back. I think it's very, very useful for me. So once again, first of all, thank you. And I would like to thank the community leaders for allowing us to participate in your discussion and learn from all of you guys. It was very, very useful. And thanks to Huairou Commission and STI for organizing this session. And of course, for Gobeshona colleagues for providing the platform. I think in the future, we could have a discussion, a dedicated discussion where we bring the climate scientists and the community groups together for an hour discussion and see what comes out of it. And if everybody speaks the same language or starts speaking the other person's language, that'd be great to see. So with that, I'm going to end the session. And once again, thank you everybody for joining, and have a great day and weekend ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergey.
Thank you.
Thanks, Surendra.
Thank you.